I am full of energy drink and ready to talk about rigging. Woo! Hello everyone, and welcome to my talk, How to Never Rig the Same Thing Twice, Reuse in Rigging. Before I get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today and pay my respect to their elders past and present. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. I would like to preface two things about this presentation. This is a 3D-focused rigging talk. If you're interested in 2D rigging, Sarah Elliott gave a great talk on that subject here yesterday, so make sure to reach out to her if you haven't already. Also, this talk is largely pre-engine and Maya focused, but a lot of the techniques I'll discuss can be used in other programs, so I'll give alternatives to the likes of Blender and Unreal, things like that, where possible. Liam O'Leary is also giving a rigging talk specific to Houdini and Unreal immediately after this one, so make sure to check that one out as well. All right, let's get started. Rigging, a taboo word, one that instills fear into the hearts of those that hear it. Spooky, scary skeletons send shivers down your spine. Rigging as a discipline is renowned for being, let's say, complicated? But I'm here today to suggest that maybe, just maybe, rigging isn't so bad. Now I know what you're thinking. This guy is crazy. People don't enjoy painting skin weights, orienting joints, FKIK switches, complete madness. But yes, there are people who enjoy those things, and what's more, with a little bit of knowledge, I think you can enjoy them too. Hi everyone, I'm Robbie Reid, the rigger. Over the last decade, I've worked in studios across the world from Australia to China and the UK. The majority of my career has been in film at workplaces like MPC and Method Studios, but over the last 3 years, I've swapped to freelance work, spending much more time in the medium of games. All my rigs are built from my own custom rigging framework in Maya, and you'll see several of them from my personal and non-NDA projects in this talk today. To quickly elaborate on my credentials, here are some of the things I've worked on. I'm not going to dwell on my film history too much, as I know this is a games-focused conference, but for what it's worth, I have worked on 2 films based on games properties. But in terms of games themselves, as is the way, only one project I've worked on has actually come out so far. The rest are still under NDA. But I can say that my rigs have been used by studios with the likes of Wildflower Interactive and Blizzard Entertainment, both of whom I work for through Superseed Studios. I'm also working locally with Beethoven and Dinosaur on their upcoming game Mixtape, which was announced at the Xbox Summer Showcase a few months ago. Pretty excited about that one. And I'm also contributing to Bones Wandering Soul for Studio Tinkerhouse, which received funding from Screen Australia earlier this year. You'll see a bit of the main character in the talk today, and you can also play the prototype at the Big Games Night at the end of the day today. So, rigging is complex. I often see it rushed past, avoided, or rolled in with other disciplines. In games, I see it as 2 core elements. 1, building a digital skeleton and deforming a model in a realistic or appropriate way. I personally call this the deformation rig. This is the asset that gets imported into game engines directly. 2, building digital puppets and tools to manipulate this skeleton so artists can use it in intuitive ways. These results are either baked down to the skeleton prior to engine integration or controlled and expanded upon in the engine directly. I call this the animation rig. So rigging is responsible for how the model deforms and the extent of animation that drives it. I often describe it as a bottleneck discipline for this reason. As so many elements rely on the rig, one small change can have ripple effects throughout an entire pipeline. Therefore, it's kind of important to pay attention to rigging. In order to reduce the likelihood of major upsets happening on your projects, I'm interested in making rigging more approachable to artists. And I want to talk about one key idea in particular, the concept of reuse. Reuse. Rig something once, use it over and over. This can be as small as a single joint chain to as large as an entire character rig. Make something small, reuse it. Use it to make something bigger, reuse that. I want to teach you some practical reuse techniques, ones I've used in high-end pipelines and within my own freelance work, so you can utilize them on your own projects. because breaking down and demystifying the rigging process ultimately helps everyone. It's less time wasted redoing work, and it leads to better, more detailed characters. I'd love for small to mid-sized studios to make use of these techniques to streamline their pipeline, or so artists who might rig on the side can use them to improve their workflow. Plus, I think it helps illustrate the benefits of good rigging in general. I'll always recommend having a dedicated rigging TD on your team as early as possible. Even just some of that early consultation can save you a bunch of hassle in the future. So, if by chance, if you're not ready to swap careers by the end of this talk, you can always reach out to us and we'll help put you on the right path. So, let's get it started with an example of how powerful reuse can be. Meet the crab monster. They have 3 sets of arms. One has a giant claw, which is asymmetrical, 2 legs with weird, spiky tripod toes, a lobster-like tail, and they're covered in chitinous armor. If I asked you, how long would it take to rig this thing? Would a day seem insane? Would an hour seem insane? That was the challenge posed by Brad Clark of Rigging Dojo last year. Download this model and see how far you can get rigging them not within a day, but within 1 hour. I foolishly accepted, and I streamed the whole thing. Here's a condensed time-lapse of me rigging the crab monster. This was my evidence that I attempted the challenge, and you can see and watch my posture get worse and worse as the video goes on. In the initial hour, through my scripts and tools, I was able to set up a basic joint hierarchy, rig, and skin cluster. I was even able to apply some animation within that time. But the animation revealed some deformation issues on the toes that I had missed. You can see them coming up there. So, to clean this up, I decided to press on for another hour and see how far I could push this character. In this portion, I was able to lay out the additional arms and tail for the creature, integrating them into the rig and skin cluster. These were the custom aspects to the character that required a little bit more time to set up. But, once again, I noted some slight issues on the claws, some deformation problems there. So, okay, like 10 more minutes, I swear that's all I need. This allowed me to clean up the final issues and animate some additional movement for the secondary arms and tail. In the end, we got a fairly complete character in 2 hours and 10 minutes. I learned a lot from this challenge, especially the benefits of working in a calm environment when you're not under any constant time pressure. Even just that little bit of extra time can give you big benefits in the end. But ultimately, my reuse techniques were overall effective in this fast-paced environment. So, how did I do this? What exactly did I reuse? Well, the character is humanoid, so I could use a lot from a human rig I had made previously. I matched my human base mesh to the crab and used it to transfer the joint hierarchy and skinning across. I didn't need to skin any of that armor manually. Each arm follows the same structure, so I could reposition and reuse the arm joints, controls, and skinning 6 times. I could remove all the fingers from the rig and replace them with single joints and controls. These, along with the FK chain I used for the tail, are core pieces of code I use in my rigs all the time. I even retargeted motion capture data to test the character, driving those secondary arms using the animation from the primary ones. Every single part of this character was ripped or reused from something I built before. Rig something once, use it over and over. These are the techniques I'd like to show you. I'm going to focus on a few key areas. After going through some basics, we'll talk about skin clusters and meshes, weight painting, joints, and animation. I've also included a little glossary here if you want to take a note or maybe grab a quick photo. In 3D, a lot of words can be interchangeable, and it's even worse when they're called different names in different programs. For example, blend shapes in Maya are shape keys in Blender and morph targets in Unreal. Woo! Unfortunately, there's no real way around this, but just know that there is some overlap between these programs, and if you know what to look for, you'll be able to reuse some of these techniques in other programs. So hopefully everybody's got a quick little mental picture, and we can dive in. Let's go through 3 basic concepts before looking at those individual techniques, the first being skin clusters. A skin cluster is a way of binding your model to a joint hierarchy. It's our primary way of deforming a rigged model in games. It determines how much weight, meaning influence, a joint has over each vertex. If a vertex has a weighting of 1 to the hip joint, it will be 100% influenced by that hip joint. If it has 0.5 to the hip and 0.5 to the knee, it will have a 50-50 influence split between those joints. So working with numerical weighting like this can be a little abstract. So we use weight painting tools to visualize this data in a user-friendly way. This is the color coding you see on the leg, the red and the white. Changing skin clusters will alter how your rig deforms. This can either be beneficial when you fix issues, or obviously create problems if you change something accidentally. Second is vertex order. Each vertex on a polygon model has a numerical ID assigned to it, the sequence of which we call the vertex order, or VO for short. These IDs are used to store information for deformers like skin clusters or blend shapes. There are simple ways to see vertex IDs in Maya. Selecting a vertex will show it in the script editor, or you can toggle them on and off via display settings. A model's vertex order will change if you use destructive modeling tools to do things like add more polygons or maybe weld two vertices together. As skinning data is stored per vertex ID, changing this order can be bad for rigging. If you have a vertex ID that's on a model's head, and all of a sudden that moves around to their back, then obviously the skinning you painted for it before isn't going to work anymore and the skin cluster breaks. But vertex orders are common as models progress, so it's important we understand how to work with these changes as they come. Third and finally, joints and animation rigs. As controls will end up moving joints, it makes sense for us to use them for positional information as well. For example, you could use the position of a wrist joint to place a hand control, or the position of an elbow joint to project out a pole vector. So not only could changing the number of, position, or hierarchy of joints have an impact on your skinning, but also the controls, rig, and any animation created with them. This has a big potential to impact other departments, so let's make sure we keep this in mind as we continue. Now, let's talk about some specific reuse cases. Saving and loading skin clusters is a great way to reuse skinning between models that share the same vertex order. As deformer data is stored per vertex, it's really straightforward to save it to an external file. Maya can do this using the export and import weight tools. In this instance, I'm saving out weights from one model, then loading them onto another model within the same scene file. So if your model's proportions change, or you want a starting point for a skin cluster on another character, loading them on is a really good way to go. Skinning is much easier when 90% of the work has already been done for you. Plus, this whole process becomes routine when using something we call a base mesh. A base mesh is a consistent mesh that you modify the proportions of for different characters, but always maintains the same vertex order. This is how all of these characters are able to blend to and from each other. I always recommend working with base meshes, and not just for rigging either. It's useful for modeling and texturing too, as a basis for sculpting different characters or reusing core UV maps. If your vertex order does change though, don't worry, it's fairly easy to copy it across from previous versions of the model. I actually do this fairly often, as when you get exports from ZBrush, they tend to be randomly reordered, so you can use the tool Transfer Vertex Order in Maya to easily sort this out. Just remember, any destructive modeling changes that will alter your vertex layout will require you to transfer skinning in other ways, and I'll talk about those in just a little bit. So even if you do end up optimizing meshes by deleting polygons underneath the hair or maybe clothes, it's still a good idea to maintain a base mesh separately as a technical tool. But how can we tell if a vertex order has changed? Well, it's pretty easy to notice. All you have to do is select a joint and move it, and if it looks like your character is either imploding or exploding, then it's probably safe to say your vertex order has changed. I call this the melting face indicator. Working with base meshes does require a bit of maintenance. If you want to work with them across different characters, you'll need to confirm the edge loops are in similar areas to ensure that the skinning matches. Here are two sets of finger geometry. They both have the same skin cluster loaded on, but one has the knuckle edge loops offset very, very slightly. The knuckles now feel sharp and angular. It's not working as well as it used to. You need to go back and either update the skinning or fix that offset in the model. So if a mesh is just a series of simple cylindrical loops, it can be hard to keep track of where these important areas are. Adding landmarks to your topology or using technical textures can help avoid this. They're also really helpful for positioning joints or aiding in deformation as well. Here are some examples of edge flow on knuckles, elbows, knees, and ankles that can help you distinguish them from their surroundings. Next, copying skin weights. This allows you to reuse skin clusters from meshes with different vertex orders. Maya has a tool called, ironically, copy skin weights, which allows you to project weights from one mesh and onto another, provided they are bound to the same joints. In this example, even though the second mesh has more edge loops, the tool will interpolate the weight between those points. So you can do this based on the position of vertices or UVs, using the closest point on surface and UV space options respectively. So we can use simplified weights on a low-resolution mesh to create smooth weights on a more complicated one, and this can give us some really useful results. Let's look at this chain mesh. How could we skin this using only 2 joints? Ordinarily, this would be really difficult. All the links are separated shells, so it would take forever to paint them manually, and also keep consistency between the chains. Weight smoothing algorithms don't really work on a mesh like this. So my solution is, don't skin it. Skin something else, a transfer mesh. A simple, continuous polygon plane with a few edge loops is much easier to weight. Once you've got it right, you bind the chain to the same joints and copy the skin weights across. Now we have a rudimentary but fairly effective skin cluster in a matter of minutes. This is what I call a transfer mesh, but I've also heard them being called cage or proxy meshes depending on what studios you work for. By reusing weights from a simplified mesh that you control, you're not restricted by models that are complex and not ideal for weight painting. Here is an example of how I used transfer meshes to great effect on a freelance project. I was hired by the company S1T2 to build some animal rigs for their Unreal-based interactive exhibit, Charmer, which was on display here at the Melbourne Museum a few years ago. The project was grounded in First Peoples storytelling, and the art direction required all the animals be made from a unifying ribbon-like geometry structure. All these meshes would be a real problem to skin manually, so I skinned more traditional animal meshes first, before copying the weights across to the final models. So the deformation differences between them are virtually indistinguishable. This way, the ribbon geometry could continue to be art-directed even after the rigging and the animation had started. When changes came through, I just copied across the skinning each time. An updated rig could be out within the hour. Having some general modeling knowledge is a great skill to have when rigging as well. Personally, it's rare for me to actually skin a highly detailed mesh on my first pass. I'll always opt to build transfer meshes for things like clothing, bodies, and a separated face in particular. And you can always smooth out and subdivide these simple meshes later on if you need more detail. Fortunately, we don't need to build these from scratch. If you have a complex mesh, you can use common retopology tools to build your own transfer meshes really quickly. They allow you to project points onto a mesh and build or extrude polygon planes from them. I recommend just picking them up and having a bit of a play around with them. You might be surprised by how fast you can start using these tools. I know I was personally. Once you get an idea of edge flow and things like that, these tools become really beneficial. So Maya has Quad Draw under the modeling tools, Blender has Polybuild, and there's even separate apps like Cozy Blanket for the iPad, if you feel like doing some rigging to relax on the couch at the end of the day. But what if we have 2 completely different models that don't match? How can we align them, establish a close overlap, so we can copy weights from one to the other? External software and plugins are your best bet for this process. I use a software called Faceform Wrap, which I'm showing a demonstration of here. Faceform also have a plugin for ZBrush called ZWrap, or you could achieve similar results using the Soft Wrap plugin for Blender. By designating snapping points on similar areas between the two meshes, Wrap allows you to pull the second mesh towards the first and iteratively smooth out the model across the other one. Then, you're free to copy the weights as you would with a standard transfer mesh. This is how I was able to transfer things from my human rig to that crab monster we saw earlier on. I could match the simplified human base mesh to the more complicated crab body and just use that as a starting point. That's how I didn't need to skin all of that armor manually. Combining weights is another way to reuse weights from a workflow that suits you. One unified mesh is often preferable in games, but if there's hidden or overlapping pieces of geometry, it might not be optimal for weight painting. So it makes sense to skin separated meshes and combine them later on. Maya's modeling combine tool actually allows us to do this. Combining separate meshes with their own unique skin clusters will result in merging both the models and those weights together. In my personal workflow, I call this process creating split meshes. So, to tie this all together, here's an example of how I use all of these skinning reuse techniques in my own sequential workflow. First, I'll start by building the low-resolution transfer meshes. I use these to quickly skin the bodies and clothing of my characters. And I'll often save these weights somewhere safe so I can load them on again in the future if I need to. Then, I'll copy the weights from the transfer meshes to the split meshes, so the smooth skinning gets copied across to the high-resolution models. Finally, after any cleanup, I'll combine these split meshes into one and then use that to copy the unified weights to the final mesh that modeling provides me. Now, although this process is much more involved than just flatly skinning a final mesh, it allows you to work more progressively towards your end goal. You can start rigging before modeling is complete, and if the final mesh changes, you don't have to start from scratch. Just update your own models, load on the skin clusters, and repeat the process. So, I've talked a lot about reusing skin clusters, but not a lot about how to actually build them in the first place. So let's talk about everybody's favorite thing, weight painting. I know, don't hate me, please. Weight painting sucks, right? Maya's default weighting tools work by subtracting weights and giving them to others. And this can be really destructive and easy to break if you don't follow specific workflows. They're not very intuitive to learn, but we need to practice in order to get better. So we're in a little bit of a predicament here. But I have an alternative. A light at the end of the tunnel. NG Skin Tools. NG Skin Tools is a Maya plugin by Victoras Makalkas and is a core part of my workflow. I know artists who use this tool in film, feature animation, and games. I could not recommend something more. With NG, the normal complexity of subtracting and adding weights is all handled under the hood, so this alone makes the basic brushes and tools so much easier to use. But it also provides a bunch of other useful features like layering, smoothing, mirroring, and limiting max influences, which is great for games. Plus, it has its own alternative saving, loading, and transfer tools. So I'm not going to go through every feature in extreme detail, but I do want to note a few which I find most beneficial. Layering, as you might expect, allows you to paint on separate layers. Think of something similar to Photoshop. Any weights on the layer above will override that on the layer below. You can even mask out layers or toggle their visibility on and off to compare differences. Weight painting now becomes non-destructive, meaning you don't have to change what you've already made in order to progress. You can make a new layer, take a chance on the skinning. If it doesn't work out, just delete that layer, start again. All the previous weights that you've done previously will be safe and sound. Personally, I like using layering to approach skinning in sequential ways. Perfect one area and then move on to the next. layers for the spine, clavicle, upper arm, lower arm, so on and so forth. This makes it easy to track down issues in your skinning as well. If your elbow's looking a little weird, just go to that layer, clean it up. Simple as that. NG's smoothing tool is really great as well. You can smooth out specific areas or an entire skin cluster without needing to manually paint it. I can roughly block in the weights for an area like the knee here, select the edge loops around that area, and run the smoothing tool a few times. A few clicks, even just with the default settings, is all it takes to get a pretty decent result. I also like to use it when I found a few stray vertices after transferring weights to a higher resolution model. A few iterations on the whole skin cluster can help buff out those areas, cleaning them up with next to no effort. And finally, you can use NG's transfer tools in very similar ways to the reuse techniques we've already discussed. Save, load, copy in world space, etc. But now you get the added benefit of maintaining layers. In this example, I quickly paint and smooth some arm weights on a low-resolution polygon plane. I can name that layer, then transfer it across to my full human mesh. Then I can position it in my layer stack and use masking to avoid skinning overriding any of the weights I've already painted on the upper arm or the body. Clean, even weighting without ever skinning the arm itself. I'll often paint entire characters by splitting their body and limbs into polygon planes or transfer meshes. It's another way to approach painting weights sequentially to get better results faster. Now, onto joints. Joint placement is crucial for good deformation. Like with offset edge loops, even small changes can yield very different results. This time, I've offset the finger joints in my example. This changes the joint lengths, altering the look of animation and turning the skinning to mush. It's important to place them in optimal positions early in production to ensure the best deformation possible without needing to redo animation later. I've worked on productions where nobody has noticed out-of-place joints until a few weeks before delivery. Trust me, you do not want to work around those nightmare issues. You don't want to deal with that kind of stuff. Keeping joint positions relative between characters using the same skinning is one thing, but how do we know what a good position for a joint is in the first place? For that, there are some general rules I like to follow. Place joints based on realism or the pivot point. Realism is based on real-world anatomy, using the articulation points of physical bones as reference points, whereas a pivot point is a position that would be advantageous in a technical way, even if it looks a little strange or out of place. For example, I see a lot of human clavicle bones placed center mass in models, but our clavicles really pivot from the front of our bodies at the top of the sternum. So placing it in this realistic position could give us more predictable deformation. I'll often opt to try realism first and pivot second. A lot of quadruped animals won't actually have physical clavicle bones, but the pivot point can still be useful to us in the rig, replicating the effect of musculature pulling the arm around the rib cage. So here on the bear, the resulting cross joints might look a little weird, but they give us a bunch of automation for free. We can reuse individual joint chains between similar rigs, as well as entire hierarchies. This is a great illustration from Satoshi Kawasaki, showing what a human leg looks like morphed into the physiology of other animals. Yeah, it's weird, for sure, but we see the general bone structure remains between all of them. If we wanted, we could absolutely use the same joints and control structures in these different examples. So the layout of a human leg could be used in something like a lizard or a bear. Hell, we can repurpose the entirety of a human joint hierarchy to be that of a bear. Or, in the case of the frog, take away a few fingers, maybe add in a tail, and you've got yourself a T-Rex. It doesn't take long to start reusing the same controls between multiple different animals and creatures once your knowledge of anatomy increases. Basically, I want to give you the power of the Animorphs. Don't you want the power of the Animorphs? Yeah, it's true that math is really useful for a career in game dev, but it turns out reading Animorphs is just as important. Remember where your priorities are, people. Last up for joints, joint count. Alongside maximum influences for skin clusters, joint counts are important for optimization. Fewer joints equals fewer influences to calculate on a mesh at the expense of less detail and control. For a rough guide, Dota 2 originally had a max count of 64 joints. Unreal's latest Mani rig has 161. I personally counted this myself a few days ago. And Overwatch characters have around 250. So if your mobile game character has 300 joints, might be a tad overkill. Reuse all the joints you can, but don't be afraid of start culling some if they're not needed. The biggest sinks are often in fingers and faces, so those are a good place to start. Here, I am progressively taking away joints from a face rig. It's actually pretty hard to tell the difference between the one that has 67 joints compared to the one that has 32. You would definitely have less finite control over some areas, but this might not be a big loss depending on the kind of project you're working on. You could even reduce this more if you just need simple things like eye movements, blinks, jaw movement, things like that. Think about what you could remove from your characters and what kind of savings you could get for free. Finally, let's talk about animation. As we know, matching joint hierarchies can be used to build matching rigs and therefore reuse animation. Rigging frameworks, commonly known as auto-riggers, are a good introduction to this process. Their user-friendly workflows give you a bunch of inbuilt functionality. Some will even generate skin clusters for you. You could use Advanced Skeleton or MGear in Maya. There's Rigify in Blender or Unreal's Control Rig. But I personally don't like calling these tools auto-riggers, hence the quotation marks. On a purely surface level, yes, these tools can be used to build entire rigs without any rigging knowledge. But I find this is a trap that people fall into. Say one automatically generates a human joint hierarchy for you, but for some reason, the finger joints get placed in weird positions. You won't know why the controls are out of place or how the deformation is broken. Unless you know some of the rigging fundamentals, like the ones I've highlighted in this talk earlier, you're just stuck with a rig that doesn't work properly. So use these frameworks to your advantage. Just make sure you're not relying on them to avoid learning more about rigging in general. It's always a good idea to test our rigs before handing them to animation. I like to do this by retargeting a range of motion workout, a long piece of motion capture data that hits many extreme poses. And I mean specifically, this one in particular. I use this one all the time. If you've worked with me, you're sick of seeing this animation. In fact, we've seen it earlier in this talk. That's what the crab monster was doing. We can use tools to retarget animation from a motion capture joint hierarchy or another rig to that of our current deformation rig. Maya has an inbuilt tool called Human IK, but you could also use a program like Motion Builder or the Rococo plugin for Blender. We can then take those updated hierarchy animations and bake it back to our animation rig controls for later use. I do this just through some basic constraining in Maya. Unreal and Unity both have the capacity to retarget skeletons in real time as well. So this can be a really big time saver when wanting to transfer large animation sets to different characters. Just be aware that any additional automation built into rigs prior to engine integration might need to be recreated. Things like twist chains, clothing or hair system, basically like any joints that interact with other joints. I'd recommend discussing these requirements early on in production to avoid potential issues in the future. Differences in face proportions are harder to overcome through retargeting. Instead, we might want to rely on graphic user interfaces, GUIs, for face controls. You can see them here on the right of the characters in the yellow box. At least I hope you can see them. These are a collection of simple, one-axis inputs that drive complex movement. We can use these to load and then export the same face animation across different characters with wildly different face structures. If you want to make a blink action, try building a 0 to 1 blink control. Then, use this to drive either a blend shape or move other joints and controls into the closed eye position. My examples here use the latter joint-based method. The facial action coding system, or FACS for short, is a great system to base your movement around. If you've seen Unreal's MetaHuman face rig before, then you've seen a rig that's based on FACS. FACS maps out and names every single action a human face can make. Things like inner brow raiser, lip corner puller, things like that, so on and so forth. It also allows you to use tools based on the iPhone's AR kit, essentially a simplified version of FACS. You can use this to extract motion capture data and use it on your own rigs. While it does take time to set up face GUIs, generalizing movement like this can do wonders to streamline your animation pipelines. So, just before I wrap up the talk, I wanted to mention scripting and coding briefly. All my rigs are entirely scripted in Python, and this is what one of them looks like. All of the reuse techniques I've discussed today, and plenty more, structured in this code. I can edit and adjust everything to suit the unique needs of whatever rig comes my way. While it took a really long time to learn, set up, and optimize, it's incredibly powerful for reuse. I'm able to run a piece of code and build a new rig in about 30 seconds. So, if you are learning rigging, I do recommend learning to code as well. But I wouldn't recommend building entire character rig builds like this until you have a little bit more experience. Instead, I'd suggest making small quality of life tools first. A good example might be making a single-click weight transfer tool, something we've learned is a big benefit today. Learn as you go, and eventually you'll have built up enough tools to start adding more automation to your pipeline. Remember, build something big from many smaller things. In summary, I hope I've demonstrated that reuse is a great way to break up seemingly complex rigging tasks and make them easier. Make something small, reuse it. Use it to make something bigger, reuse that. With a little know-how, reuse workflows with meshes, skin clusters, joints, and animation rigs can speed up and enhance game pipelines. Difficult tasks become easier, allowing you to put more detail into your characters, reduce the chance of redoing work, and ultimately improve the quality of your projects overall. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for coming to my talk, and I hope you learned something useful. Once again, my name is Robbie Reid, and you can find me as either Robbie Reid Rigs or Chowgood on most platforms. I'm generally an open book when it comes to rigging information, so if you want to talk about your projects or just ask some general questions, feel free to reach out to me here in person or online at any time. But if you have any specific questions right now, I'll throw it to the Q&A portion of the talk. Thanks a lot, everyone. Are there any questions? No, that makes my life easier. Yes. Oh, do you want to use the mic? Or I can just repeat your question if you're...
Where did you start, how did you start doing scripting and stuff in Maya? Did you have any prior experience before that?
The question was, how did I start scripting in Maya, and did I have any experience prior to it? I actually started scripting in my first job as a rigging TD. That was at a studio called Alt VFX up in Queensland, in Brisbane. Before that, I was largely doing manual rigging, and I was a very stubborn person being like, I'm never going to need to use scripting in my rigs. I'm just going to do it all manually. How hard can it be? And then my mentor, who was the head of rigging at the time of the company, Jordan McInnes, he taught me a little bit of Mel scripting, and it blew my mind, and I realized I'd been doing it the stupid way, and I should be scripting out a whole lot more things. So in a similar way, I started building small quality of life tools, and eventually, over a long period of time, that allowed me to sort of build up my own pipeline. I actually haven't really been taught coding in a formal setting. Most of my coding has been learned through online tutorials and the things like that, so yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh, there might be a microphone for you.
Sorry. In terms of the demand you're talking about for joint count, would you advocate for using blend shapes as well, especially where it comes to facial
Ooh, that is a good
Deformation?
question. It can depend. So I actually haven't done much comparison myself internally. I've just had other people tell me that blend shapes are normally more intensive for game engines and take up more memory. So generally, I opt to try not to use them unless absolutely necessary. It can be a good simplified way of speeding up face production, because if you have a dedicated face modeler, I mean, it might depend on how big your studio is, maybe not for indie productions, but if you have somebody separate sculpting the meshes or whatever, it's much easier to just ingest those into the rig and hook them up to controls. But it might depend on the demands of your games. If you're going for mobile joints, you can get away with quite a lot with joints, as hopefully I demonstrated in some of the rigs there. So it's more just about like learning how to optimize your skin clusters and just figuring out what joints are the most important to get the kind of movement that you'd want. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions? One up the back, one there.
I just had a question, I guess, more about your experience with rigging. I'm looking over your portfolio. What was like the most hardest rig for you to do?
Hardest rig. I probably can't talk about it, unfortunately, as all of the stuff I put up there was basically NDA projects. Generally, I wouldn't say I've worked on too many characters that are like hard per se. The complexity of it's like complexity of the character, which just requires a longer amount of time to work on them. Like I've worked on a character for 5 months straight on a film project, and that was like not necessarily complicated, but the complexity of just like the in-depth nature of the character and how much needed to be rigged up and everything was sort of the issue. Once you get sort of like skinning workflows down, especially for humans, you can automate a lot of the complexity away, so those things become easier, and then it's like clothing and all the custom stuff that becomes the stuff that's more difficult in the end. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Any others? I think there was one up the back. How are we doing for time?
I'm very new into my rigging journey and I primarily use Maya. I'm in the very basic understanding at the start at the moment. Would you recommend just going into the program, messing around with rigging and just joint hierarchies to get a good understanding of it before obviously going into more complex things?
Yeah, absolutely. Technically, I've never had any formal training in rigging. Like all my rigging, or at least initially before I got work, was downloading rigs online and picking them apart node by node to see how things work. I do recommend doing that because it allows you to become better at problem solving. Because more often than not, if you're working in a bigger studio, somebody will come up to you and say, hey, this rig is broken, fix it. And obviously, it's really daunting if you don't know what to do if somebody's just handing you something. The idea being like you'd have to go, in the case of Maya, into the node editor and follow things in the graph bit by bit and just try and find out where the issues are. I had a face rig on a project once that was like running at 2 FPS. So my lead at the time gave that to me and said, hey, animation wants this to run at 24 FPS because that's what animation wants all the time. So I went in bit by bit, found out where all the issues were, and then within a few days, I'm like, the rig's running at 30 FPS now, and animation said, thank you. So I think like just picking it up, having a play around, also just asking questions as well. Like I said, like feel free to reach out to me. There's also a bunch of there's a Discord called Ask a Rigger, which is normally quite a good place to go if you want any questions answered. It's not just for Maya there, it's for Blender, it's for Houdini and everything. So if you're finding a particular problem that you can't get, places like that are a good place to go. Any other questions? Yeah, up the back.
So I guess from a standpoint of being just a general artist and not necessarily wanting to specialize and stuff, do you have any advice for getting started with being more efficient with rigs and just like, do you recommend everyone has like a base mesh and something rig that they can always sort of transfer from? Is that...
I'd generally say if you're like not interested in specializing in rigging in particular, would kind of approach it from a more generalist approach. Those auto riggers I mentioned before are really good things to use. Like I said, I wouldn't, like, you can fall into the trap of just being like, advanced skeleton will do everything for me. And then I come along and I fix all the problems that come with the rig that's built in that kind of way. So as long as you're like utilizing them to sort of just like get a good rig for your characters, but you know things to look out for, like you know, joint positions, how to make the most out of your skin clusters by reusing them from characters you might have built before or whatever. Yeah, use them as a tool. Just don't use them as a crutch. That's probably what I'd maybe recommend, yeah. Any other questions? A few more up the front. I think we've only got a few minutes left, so maybe these last two. Yeah.
Hey, do you often find yourself having to go back to the modelers and actually telling them or getting them to retopologize some stuff because your joints aren't working out?
It does happen sometimes. More often than not, because I work freelance, the workflow is generally fairly fast-paced. So if a model is not optimal for rigging, I will just build my own version of the model that is optimal for rigging and transfer the skin clusters across from that. So the likes you might have seen with, within the presentation, that jacket that I had, and I was building the quad mesh for it. In that case, that would be me like, oh, modeling's given me this, I'm just going to build a quick model for it quickly, make sure all the edge flow is good for rigging, and use it to transfer stuff. There will be cases where rigging cannot progress unless the model is done in a specific way. This might be for more like low resolution mobile characters where maybe like I physically can't curl the fingernails without like a huge amount of volume loss. So generally like communication is important. So you can say to like modeling like, hey, would it be faster if you updated this for me? Or would it be faster if I just did it quickly? And you know, it's kind of a balancing act sometimes. So just good to communicate. Good to communicate in general, everybody. Yeah. And I think one more.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I was really impressed by some of the workflow improvements you get from NG Skin Tools. I wanted to know if you had any suggestions for non-Maya alternatives to that.
So there isn't currently one for Blender. I know there are some in development, but I can't say anything about them, unfortunately. So I'd maybe just say, keep an eye out for them in the future. Not too distant future, hopefully. So yes, I think there is one coming from Blender, and currently you can do some basic skinning stuff in Unreal, but Unreal's skinning tools are still very new. They've only been in the last few releases, I think, and you can't do things like copy skin weights. There's no layering system. There may very well be in the future. I have a feeling like some of the people that I know are working with them might probably suggest that in the future. So I have a feeling maybe in a year or two time, there may be something like that. But me personally, until I can like have that same workflow in another program, I'm probably sticking with Maya. And Maya's not a bad tool as well. Like I know it's expensive, but it's actually a very good tool for animation with the use of parallel evaluation. Like my rigs, I just got a new computer, they run at 120 FPS, like they're pretty fast, and on old hardware, they can be like 60, 50 FPS. So Maya is very good for making animation run fast, provided you know how to set up the rig in that way. Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Cool. Is that it for time? Maybe one more question, if there's any? Nope. Oh, yeah. One more.
That stream you had with the crab, is that still available?
I think so. I think I've uploaded it to my YouTube channel. It was fun. I left on stream rewards, so if you noticed in that video, I actually changed shirts. It goes from like a white shirt to a black shirt because somebody redeemed a reward that required me to put on a funny shirt. So I raced into my bedroom, raced back out, and kept rigging. So it was like multiple layers of rigging under pressure on that stream. But yeah, I do stream online. I tend to like, if people have more questions or want me to go through things specifically, like I can do that on the stream, and I put up video archives on YouTube for people. So yeah, that's my link tree there. I think my Twitch and that should be linked in there if anybody feels like checking it out. Yeah.
Thank you.
One more, are we out of, yep, one more. Yep.
Just, do you have access, or is there access to the test animation that you showed us?
Oh, the motion capture one? Yes, it was made by, Emilio, let me see if I can go back to, that's it there, Emilio Serrano, yes. That's on his Gumroad, and you can get it for free. So yeah, would recommend. He's also got a bunch of cool free rigs on there as well, built using M Gear, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe check those out as well. I also have a free rig as well. If you want to download that, the person with the sword in the top right-hand corner. That's the Guardian rig. You can get that free on my gun road as well if you want to kind of pick apart some of my characters. Yeah, I think that's it, all we have time for. Thanks very much, everybody.